Hello and welcome to the Atlanta History Center's virtual author talk series. I'm Virginia Prescott from GPB and your host for these talks. Tonight I'm talking with Charles Blow about The Devil You Know, a Black Power Manifesto. You can purchase the book directly from Acapella Books. There's a link in the chat at the right of your screen, or you can just go to the Atlanta History Center's website and purchase it there. As Charles and I are talking, please do submit your questions into the Q&A. That's the only feature we use. Don't put them into the chat. It's at the bottom of your screen, and I'm going to try and integrate as many of them as possible as I can during the conversation. Charles Blow is a New York Times columnist and host of Prime Time with Charles Blow on BNC. He's also a commentator for CNN, who's also appeared on MSNBC, CNN, Fox News, the BBC, Al Jazeera, HBO. He's author of now 2 New York Times bestselling books, Fire Shut Up in My Bones and The Devil You Know, which makes the case for as many Black people as possible to reverse the path of the Great Migration and move to the American South, the land from which their ancestors fled in many cases. Charles Blow has blazed that trail himself, decamping from Brooklyn to Atlanta in January of 2020. And we're lucky to have him in the city and so honored to have him with us tonight. Charles Blow, welcome.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
So you were born in Gibbsland. This is a tiny town in Louisiana in 1970. So that's at the tail end of the Great Migration.
Yes.
And you describe it as a world shaped by vacancy. What was it like, your town?
First, it still has about 900 people, but there were houses everywhere that didn't have occupants it was a very segregated town. So that was on the Black side of town. And so you'd see, an active field house, and next door would be a graying house because it was never painted and the planks were graying and it was vacant. And so this was all over the area. And and part of that was because of the Great Migration. There were, this person had moved away to Michigan, or this person their family now lived in California. Also, there were a lot of grandparents raising grandchildren. Someone had moved away, but they sent the children back, or the child had not adjusted well to being in a big city, got in trouble or something, and then they were back in our small town. And so the Great Migration, without us even being part of it, had just a huge impact on the culture and the fabric of the town.
And you, after you graduated from college, you left as well, as some 6 million Black Americans did in the 20th century. This was a seismic shift in the cultural, the economic, the social life of the country. And there are some initial benefits to moving to these supposedly liberal cities in the North that you write became ultimately a stinging failure. So
Right.
what were the upsides, and when did that start to shift?
Well, some of the upsides remain. So there are some studies that say there is a marginal uh, difference in the incomes of people who migrated to the north, and that has redounded to their descendants. So some of that income disparity that benefited people who migrated has remained. The problem, however, was that there was a promise embedded in the Great Migration that you were moving to a place that was much more egalitarian, that was going to allow for a more seamless inclusion into the social, economic, and political structures. That was not true even from the very beginning. There was not the same exploitation of labor that existed in the South, but there was also tremendous backlash to this massive influx of Black people. In fact, you get Red Summer in the summer. The height of it is in the summer of 1919, but the Great Migration starts in 1916. It is right at the beginning of the Great Migration that people freak out. And you get this massive wave of violence in cities all across America. Take Chicago, for instance. That is, they did a study of what caused that riot, and their conclusion was part of it was just that there was just not enough space for everyone. There was no new housing being built for the people who were coming there. Black people who are arriving, and every time Black people try to move out of the little part of the Black side, the South Side of Chicago, into a white neighborhood, they were met with massive violence. The houses were firebombed and all sorts of things, and it was that pressure that Black people could be moving into residential areas that have been controlled by white people that was part of it. Another part of it was there were a lot of soldiers. You know, the reason that Great Migration starts in the very beginning is there's a lack of workers. A
Mhm.
lot of these soldiers are away at war in the First World War, still a segregated military to a large degree at that time. A lot of Black soldiers were not simply not included in that war. So you have all these Black able-bodied men available to work. Northern industry needs those workers. They send agents to the South to recruit anyone they can, including Black people. So they arrive to do these jobs. As those soldiers start to come back, wanting their old position in society back, including their old jobs, there is another rub.
Mhm.
How dare you think that you can take my place? And so all of that is happening at the same time. And so that the idea that you were going to that it was going to be so much better never materializes. In fact, one of the things that comes after Red Summer and all of that tension is racial covenants,
Mhm.
because Black people had tried to move out and it had caused all this violence. You know, banks and real estate agents in the cities like Chicago, but also other cities, simply said, we will write an exclusionary clause into the deed. You simply cannot sell this to anyone who is Black. Neither can anyone who is Black even rent this property. It is in the deed, right? And so all of this is happening not in the South, but in the North. And then when you get to the civil rights movement, as Dr. King wrote um, in an article he wrote, I think it was a Saturday Review, he wrote after the Watts riots in the 60s, because you had another burst of rioting in a lot of cities across America in the 60s after the civil rights movement, the civil rights bill was passed. And Dr. King describes how the civil rights movement was largely a regional movement
Mhm.
for the South. And most of the benefits redounded to people who lived in the South. And so Black people in other parts of the country, those who had fled the South in search of better opportunity, we're looking at progress being made in the South, but nothing was happening where they were. As King said, you know, the progress that the South experienced had largely skipped over all these places. They saw their condition not get better during the time of the civil rights movement, but deteriorate. The slum areas they lived in, those houses deteriorated. The schools that their kids went to deteriorated. And so there was kind of a backlash, kind of relative backlash. How is it that we can see that the country can do something, but it is not doing something to better my condition here in Watts, here in Detroit, here in Chicago?
Well, that's one of the points you make in the book, is that this idea that there were some places in the country that were safe and egalitarian, but you're right, racial egalitarianism is often a long distance affair. You know, we can sit here in the north or sit here in the north and say, well, those brutes down south kind of thing, but the same thing was going on everywhere, because this is just baked in the cake of America. But
Right.
so it dispels this idea of this safe harbor. And I just also want to underscore that these are not relics of the past that we're talking about in the 10s and the in the 60s, but also you present data on anti-Black bias in the North and South in contemporary America, and on the numbers of Black people imprisoned in the North and South. What are the kind of things that you found?
Well, I asked the people at the implicit bias project. Implicit is what it's called, and they have done like hundreds of thousands of these online tests to measure implicit bias. One of those measurements being racial bias. The way they measure racial bias is pro-white, anti-Black bias. I asked them to look at the data that they have collected from all these hundreds of thousands of tests and cut that data by region and by race. And what they found, that there was no difference whatsoever in the amount of pro-white, anti-Black bias between the North, the Midwest, and the South. None.
Hmm. Well, there's a comparison you make in there that I often think of racism as having developmental cycles. In the South, it's an old man. Their racism hasn't vanished, far from it, but it has come to terms with itself. In the North, particularly in destination cities, racism is a teenage boy acting out as the old man did years ago. How do these cycles manifest, and how does this work into your proposition that people move back to the South?
Well, if you look at the ways that oppression is now working in these, what I call destination cities, the places to which Black people moved in the Great Migration, those are the places where you are experiencing the most militarization of the police. That is the same mechanism that caused the oppression in the South. It was the state, it was the police to a large degree. In the very beginning, it was outlaws, it was the red shirts, and then it was the Klan that moved indoors and that became the actual police departments, right? Very often in lynchings, the people were pulled out of a jail. You know, the people, the police were complicit in this. When you look at the march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Bloody Sunday, those are the police swinging those billy clubs wrapped in barbed wire, right? So that was the way that the South had exerted its control. It went away from terrorist groups marauding through the night to the people in the blue uniforms. In the destination cities, that has become the way that they use police forces, right? All of that militarization, stop and frisk is not something that happened in Mobile, Alabama. That happened first in New York City and was exported to Chicago and Los Angeles. The SWAT team is developed not in Jackson, Mississippi. It is developed in California in response in large part, in response to the Black Panthers and the fact that they were armed.
Right, and also another observation in the book that many of the high-profile cases of police violence or vigilante shootings against unarmed Black people have happened in these destination cities, in New York, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Chicago. But these are also the same cities that had the race riots in the 1910s and the uprisings after Dr. King was killed in the 1960s. So, what is the connection there for you?
Well, first of all, is interesting that about every 50 years you have the same thing happen. You have a massive bunch of civil unrest and protest and violence in the 1910s, then in the 1960s, and then in the 2010s, right? So that's just an interesting thing onto itself. The correlation to me is, I think, still the same, which is uh, the basic condition of massive policing of communities of color in these cities has not fundamentally changed. In fact, if you look at places like New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, that militarization has only increased since the 1960s.
Right. Well, and all this supports the case that you make that Black people did not quite, quote, escape the white supremacism of the South by migrating north, and that those who can should move back south. Pearlie asks, why did you decide to move to Atlanta?
Because I was completely convinced of my theory there, in the book, so I decided that I should take my own advice.
Well, so the term South is a term of some dispute. How do you define the new destination cities of the South?
So I go by the census designation of what is the South, which is far more expansive than most of us Southerners would consider what the South is. But in order to not get into a fight with someone about whether or not it's below the Mason-Dixon line or whether it's the former Confederacy or what, if you just argue based on culture, what is Southern culture, the South looks very different than the way that the census counts us out. I don't know anyone personally who would consider Delaware a Southern state, but the census does and always has.
Peggy asked, does your book directly engage with The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson? If so, how?
It does not directly engage with that book because that book chronicles the departure. And also, while it absolutely talks about some of the resistance they face, it's very much kind of a celebration of this phenomenon. What I discuss here is that there are limits, particularly political limitations on the Great Migration. In fact, there is a huge political downside. This is the reason that Frederick Douglass did not want anyone to migrate out of the South, because he realized immediately that at that time, 3 of the Southern states were majority Black. Another 3 of those Southern states were within 2 percentage points. Florida was within 4 percentage points of being majority Black. There was tremendous opposition to the political power that Black people all of a sudden had dropped into their laps. But Douglass, like a lot of thinkers at the time, thought, if there is a way to weather this, you have been given the right to vote by the 15th Amendment. The last thing we want to do is to dilute the power that you now have by spreading ourselves out over 50 states rather than concentrating in 15.
So there's the whole density versus dispersal thing
Yes.
going on, and you kind of pick that up, right? What would have happened if Black people had stayed in the South instead of leaving in such large numbers?
All right, so let's start with all the giant ifs. So if they hadn't left, and if the Civil Rights Bill had still passed, and if Black people vote the way they vote now over that whole period. So those are huge ifs with a zillion variables or whatever. But just for academic purpose, we're going to go with that. Then Black people would control or be the controlling interest in a coalition of up to 14 Senate seats. You would control or be the controlling interest in a coalition of more electoral college votes in California and New York State combined. The Supreme Court would look completely different because you wouldn't have had a Republican president since Reagan. Right? So the entire structure of power on the federal level would be completely different. In addition to that, you would be controlling the state, the governor's mansion, even if not the state legislature. State legislatures can still be manipulated by gerrymandering within the state, but statewide races, you can't gerrymander those. So, so the governorship could be controlled by those people as well, and having that many people and that much control would totally reshape how the approaches in those areas to mass incarceration, criminal justice, education, and health policy.
Yeah, but if we're looking at, according to the EJI, at least there are documented cases, 4,400 cases of lynchings, not just in the South, we should point out, not exclusively. How many more might have died? And also you make the point that Black political power and Black vengeance stoke fear deep in the hearts of white people. So if the numbers of civil and voting rights protesters had gone much higher, would the oppression have been all the greater? Would the terror have been all the more horrific?
Well, it's important to understand this about the data on lynching. It peaks well before Black people even decide to leave. Black people endure between the end of the Civil Wars, which is in 1865, and the time they start to migrate, which is 1916. That's 50 years. Black people could leave. They're free. They could go anywhere. The majority of Black people stay put, even through the mass terror and lynching, right? So by the time Black people actually start to move out of the South, the number of lynching is already far into decline. So it is not like they move only because of terror. It is they move because of terror and isolation, but they also move for economics. The cotton states had basically, the cotton economy had basically collapsed because of the infestation of the boll weevil. So they had stayed there. This is an important point to make. There is a spiritual connection, I believe, of Black people to the South. even during enslavement, the majority of freed Black people did not live in the North, they lived in the South.
Mhm.
That was when it was, even the most treacherous to be a Black person in the South.
Yeah, that's something you get at in the book also. In fact, write really beautifully about that kind of idea of the trees that are still there in the South that were probably standing when the horrors of Jim Crow were going on. And this connection to land and soil and place, the deeply emotional connection. I just wonder if you could elaborate on that and what that means to people that you've spoken to about living in the South.
Right. I mean, the soil of the South is soaked with the blood of Black people, and that's just a fact. And for the entire 400 plus years that Black people have been in America, the majority of them have been in the South and remain in the South. So the legacy and connection to that land is incredibly long. If you are a Black resident of Detroit and you walk to the cemetery, maybe you have two gravestones in there related to your family. Maybe if your grandfather or great grandfather was one of the first migrants, but very likely it's freer than that. In addition to that, uh, many of the people who migrated gave up on the idea of land ownership as a vehicle to equality, which was central to the post-slavery narrative of the South for Black people. That owning the land was going to be part of how you were going to build wealth and you're going to have a legacy for your family. People let that go.
Mhm.
And so now they ended up in these places where they were not historically, generationally connected to the society. They
Mhm.
were not bound to the land by any sense of history. And also, they didn't own any of it.
Yeah.
It was a rootless kind of existence. Now, on the plus side, that kind of liberated a lot of people to be incredibly creative and drew a lot of creatives. And so you get the Harlem Renaissance out of the first wave of the Great Migration. But it also meant that you were in a more transient society and a society that was not as moored in history and tradition as the Black people who lived in the South. And that history and tradition meant something, and it had onto itself a value that I want people to recognize when I write about it in the book.
One of the other fascinating things in the book is that I had not heard about is that this is not the first time that this has happened, that there has been a manifesto or an idea of moving en masse, a mass migration to particular states, to occupy particular states. Came up in the Republic of New Africa. This is in the
Absolutely.
1960s
Hmm.
idea. But the model that you're actually looking at was Vermont, of all
Yes.
places,
Yes.
taking over Vermont. Can you tell us more about this? This is what you're saying could be the blueprint.
Absolutely. So a lot of the colonization concepts were nationalist concepts, so Black nationalism or whatever, and many of the calls were for give us this land or let us settle this and have a separate place away, separate and apart from the United States. That's never going to work. The United States is never going to cede an inch of land. So but what the Vermont model, how it is different, is that it uses the Constitution itself as a vehicle for colonization, right? So uh, uh, in the 60s into the early 70s, you have all these protests, largely young hippies, white kids protesting against the Vietnam War. Black, some other people too, uh, uh, but but they're not getting their way. And Nixon is executing that war exactly as he planned, and none of this is phasing him one bit. And two Yale law students writing a Yale review, and I think it's 1972, about saying to the young hippies, like, you're never going to get a revolution the way you think you're going to. You can't take over. You can't have an armed rebellion. None of this is going to work. But what you can do is what they call radical federalism. You can just move. and to one of these smaller states and take it over. Half of the power in the Constitution is given to the federal government, but the other half is reserved, as the Constitution, the word they use, for the states. In fact, any power that is not explicitly given to the federal government in the Constitution is reserved for the state. So anything that comes up will be reserved for the state. And they propose that you take over Vermont. And it just kind of languishes there. And then a more prominent writer picks it up, writes an article in Playboy explicitly under the headline, "Take Over Vermont." And he lays out the math, and tens of people had already started to move to Vermont, but now tens of thousands of more young white kids move to Vermont. They don't move because they have a job and a house waiting. Many of them set up communes just to survive, sleep in the fields, whatever they have to do, but they move. And they changed Vermont from one of the most conservative states in America to now one of the most liberal states in the union. It is the state in 2008 where Barack Obama wins his largest share of the white vote. It is the same state that gives you people like Bernie Sanders, because they basically changed Vermont from New Hampshire into Vermont.
It's so ironic too, because the states' rights argument was the backbone of Nixon's Southern strategy, and
Mhm,
also Ronald Reagan's appeal to disaffected white supremacist voters in the South,
mhm.
certainly turning around states' rights to colonize in this
Yes,
way.
yes.
We use Georgia as a proof of concept and how to increase Black population and how that could potentially change political power at the state level.
Mhm,
Um, Many of the southern destination cities you point to, however, they are pockets of blue in seas of red,
mhm,
like Atlanta, for example,
mhm,
Savannah, Columbus, here in Georgia. And the urban areas are often blue, but then you have the General Assembly, the governor, the majority conservative legislatures who
mhm,
pass, these tough on crime legislation and voting restrictions like SB 202. So
mhm.
how would you encourage reverse migration to the rural South, or would you, so that they can fill in those pockets of blue?
Well, I'm not. I first identified a bunch cities, bigger, larger cities, the places that you already identified as blue. The the first hurdle for me is the statewide races. These are the races that cannot be gerrymandered. Uh, Now, state legislatures can try to restrict or suppress votes, and that is a thing, and that will happen. Uh, but uh, but it can be overcome. The only reason that Stacey Abrams is not the governor of Georgia is because of some voter restrictions, right?
Mm.
But Stacey Abrams didn't go crawl in a hole and say they defeated me and we're doomed. She set about to, with a bunch of other groups, to help overcome the hurdle, and that is precisely what they did. Now, there were two things that happened simultaneously. A lot of organizing, particularly organizing has been happening forever, but particularly in the last few years. But also, uh, has been reverse migration to Georgia. Georgia, particularly the area around Atlanta, is the number one destination for reverse migration
It is
in of
shockingly so.
Black people in America. Right?
The numbers are unbelievable, actually.
Unbelievable. And so what happened was, you know, in the last time that Georgia went for a Democrat was 1992 with Bill
Yeah, yeah,
Clinton.
yeah.
But Black people were not the majority of that coalition because they were only 25% of the state. From 1990 to 2020, the Black population of Georgia doubles from 1.7 million Black people to now over 3.4 million Black people. They go from being 25% of the population of Georgia to now over 33% of the population of Georgia. And that was the key. Not only were they doing more organizing, there were literally more bodies to organize. And that put them over the hurdle, over the hill. And the first, and where you're going to have to start is with the statewide races. You may not overtake the legislature immediately, but having a governor who has a pen and veto power is one of your first guards against what a state legislature can do.
Mhm. Well, at this point, though, are there any other I'll go back to Stacey Abrams, actually. It took her 10 years of working on the ground steadily in order to build up this coalition to register 800,000 new voters. So how long a game are you looking at, Charles Blow, for the reverse migration?
The original Great Migration took 60 years.
Mhm.
This is not an overnight concept. This is not the benefits. You may not reap the benefits yourself. You're talking about intergenerational vision here. It may really be a benefit that happens for your children.
What do you imagine in the next 10 years here in Georgia and for the South?
Well, I am waiting patiently for all of the census tables to be released because I suspect that reverse migration has actually picked up.
Mhm.
When you look at places like Ohio that keeps losing residents, particularly Black ones, now they're losing yet another a congressional seat.
Mm.
Places like New York, in the last census, it was the first census since Reconstruction that the number of Black people in New York City fell. That was because of people leaving, largely because of reverse migration. I believe that this is going to pick up, and that will kind of further this argument. But I have to wait for the data to come out to see if that's correct.
Question here from a listener. Gentrification is often thought of as wealthy and well-to-do whites moving to a formerly neglected Black area and running the Black citizens off, but wealthy and well-to-do Black people can gentrify as well. How do we ensure this does not happen with the reverse migration strategy while dealing with the tensions between Black people that have and the many of us that do not?
I, this plan that I'm outlining is specifically about Black political power. It will not erase income inequality. It will not erase poverty. It will not erase food scarcity. If racial majorities erase those issues for the racial majority, then every white person in America would be prospering right now because every state in America except Hawaii has been majority white for the last 90 years. That's not what happens. These are human beings. They're still going to have those problems. The what the point that I am making though is that in the aggregate, people will do better when they are not suffering under systems designed and implemented by white supremacy than if they are.
Hmm. What about the potential exodus of Black voters from from the North and the Midwest in states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, which made critical differences for Joe Biden, for example, in this last election? Would these states likely shift Republican if they lose a significant Black population?
This is another important point to make. When I say Black power, I do not mean Democratic Party power, nor do I
Uh-huh.
mean
That
Republican
we
Party
should get into
power,
that. Yeah.
right? Neither one of those. I'm saying having enough power to put enough pressure on both parties to be responsive to you. Right now, Black people in those swing states are what are, and pretty much anywhere, are what political scientists called a captured constituency.
Mhm.
Because you're voting 90+% for one party, but you cannot on your own deliver a single state, your priorities always get shifted to the back. They only lean on you when white people basically split down the middle and they call you in to break the tie,
Mhm.
right? You're not the priority. You're 10% in Michigan or 15% in Pennsylvania. If you were truly the priority, when Hillary Clinton lost to Donald Trump in 2016, we would have spent 2 years talking about how is it that we can get the level of Black participation back up to the level that it was when Barack Obama won his election. That's not what we heard. What we heard was 2 years of talking about white economic anxiety and who can appeal to the white working class better. In fact, the person who is president now started his campaign by explicitly saying that I am the person who can win back the white working class voters. That was not, or that campaign, nor the Democratic Party's position was oriented around exciting the voting base that is the most loyal to them.
Mhm. Mhm.
So how do you get out of being called in just to break the tie? You consolidate enough of your power so you can deliver on your own a state.
Right. So the Black voters have been the backbone of the Democratic Party for a long time. And as you said, they've been failed over and over again or used as pawns. I think the quote from James Baldwin is, so what gives you faith in the system being able to switch, to be loyal to Black voters or to work for Black voters, especially after so many years of being resisting with all the power that it possibly has to honor the will of Black voters?
Well, it's not a faith. It is, the Constitution is a rigid document. We haven't amended it in quite a while, and that is because the way the country is set up and the polarization of the parties means that it's almost impossible to get. It would be almost impossible these days to get a constitutional amendment through. That means that if you have let this thing calcify, that calcification works in the favor of this proposition because the way that the Senate is set up is set in stone. The way that the electoral college works, even though I believe it unfair, is set in stone. By moving to states where you become either the leading portion of the winning coalition, which is what happened in Georgia for the very first time in America. I do not have the data on Reconstruction. However, it is the first time since Reconstruction that Black people were the majority of a coalition that delivered a state for any presidential candidate. And it is the first time that Black people in the entire history of the Senate were the majority of a coalition that elected a senator. And they didn't just elect one, they elected two.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That is what power begins to feel like. That is not even making it to 50%. That's just at 33%.
Well, but to your point, if you're talking about the most audacious power play by Black Americans in the history of the country here, this is what you call it in the book. But you also cite these kind of examples of how threatened white people respond to Black power or progress, from emancipation onto the election of Barack Obama. So now we have the response of, after those historic victories for Democratic senators in Georgia, the voter suppression laws in Georgia. Cheryl asks, do you think they will have a measurable impact, and how do we fight against it?
Well, we'll be able to measure in 2018 because people will actually go out to vote, and we'll be able to see what effect, judging this election by other midterm elections, we'll be able to judge what effect these voter suppression laws have. The fight for civil rights has never existed in the absence of opposition. It always existed in the presence of opposition. This is a radical proposition, and there's no such thing as a revolutionary proposition without risk or resistance. There just isn't. So you can make a choice. You can just say, this is the way I have. I'm going to stay here in Cleveland. I'm going to be a small percentage of the population of this state. They're going to pass laws that protect police officers so they can shoot Tamir Rice down in a park in broad daylight with cameras footage to back it up, and no one charges anyone with that crime. Or you can move to a state where that is not the situation. You can say, I'm going to stay here in the Northeast. I'm going to stay in Vermont because it's so liberal. But Vermont locks up, as a portion of the population, more Black people than any state in America. You can just say, I'm going to accept it. Or you can say, I want to be part of a fight.
A little backtracking here. Somebody asked, what are the numbers that have returned to Georgia in the reverse migration? I think we were talking about just the...
Right. So I was just saying that the number of Black people in Georgia doubles from 1990 to 2020, from 1.7 million in 1990 to over 3.4 million in 2020, and we don't have the data yet because we have the detailed tables from 2020 census.
But there was some stunning numbers, like in the Atlanta, Roswell, Sandy Springs region. I was reading something like 275,000 people in just like since 2010, which is 2010 to 2016, which is an amazing, quite a number. Let me see if I can get some more. Do you ever think that Georgia will ever experience the same openness and liberal mindset as Vermont?
Well, see, this is the thing that is important to point out to the people listening today. Liberalism and racial egalitarianism are not the same thing, right? I can completely believe that we should save the planet and rescue the whales, and I believe in people, gay people should be able to marry, and I believe in a woman's right to choose, and I can still be a raging white supremacist. I may not have the same spite, I may not use the same language, but I still buy houses in places where Black people do not live so that my children do not have to go to school in places where they are outnumbered by Black people or Hispanic people or Asian people.
You're not centering white people, in fact, spotlight the belief in racial superiority embedded in the heart of white liberals, as you were just pointing out. These are the expensive yoga pant wearing $8 latte
Right.
drinking white people. But what is the role for white people in your proposal or your manifesto?
Well, it's really aimed at giving Black people an option that does not require them to ask anybody for permission or their philanthropy. But this is something you can do on your own. What I always say is that everyone, including white people, should not want to be racist, and they should want to do that for themselves. Don't do it for me. Don't think that my liberation should hinge on whether or not you grow. You should want to grow because you should not want to be anti-science and anti-historical. You should want to grow because you don't want to be part of the ignorant class that believes that race is a fundamental real thing, but in fact, the only thing that's fundamental is real is racism, not the race, right? Uh, but do that for you. This plan does not require an action from you.
Christina asked, Mr. Blow is assuming Black voters are a homogenous group in their needs and demands. White voters are split in their desires when voting. Why would Black voters be different?
Again, I am not saying that Black power is equivalent. It means Democratic power, liberal power, conservative power, or Republican power. What I'm saying is that self-determination is the key. I would love to live in a world where Black people could do what white people do, which is basically split their vote down the middle, that they can cross back and forth between Democrat and Republican at will because their life does not depend on it, right? It- People of Mexican descent or South American descent can't do that because they see people at the border in cages and everybody keeps going on about their lives like there's no problem there. Black people can't do that because we just had a raging white supremacist in the White House surrounded by white supremacists who were his advisors. So we don't have the option at this moment to split our vote. But do understand that a lot of people are voting Democrat just because they cannot vote for the white supremacists or the people who court racists. That is a hostage vote. That is not an enthusiast vote for many of those people because they don't have the liberty that white people have, which is that they can vote, they can switch. You can be a swing voter if you're white. And your life is not dependent on that.
I'm assuming that you were writing this book during the last year, during the Trump presidency. Has the urgency or the sense of your purpose for the manifesto, has that changed at all in the new administration?
Nothing has fundamentally shifted about the nature of power because it is new president. Every person he appoints will be that position will be reappointed when the next person is elected president, whether that be in 4 years or 8 years. And the way American politics performs is like a pendulum. We swing as far away from the last person as we can when we elect the next one. That's how it has happened, for the last 20 or 30 years. Donald Trump is the exact opposite of Barack Obama in some ways, and in most ways, and Joe Biden is the exact opposite of Donald Trump in most ways. So, what is to say that we won't get another authoritarian white supremacist in the House in 4 to 8 years? You can't plan this idea of liberation based on 4 and 8 year increments. It has to be generational.
Question here. This swings back to the idea that you talked about with the police, the racism and police violence in the North, and the policies that protect it. What about the killing of Rayshard Brooks and the police officer who shot him, just being reinstated actually this week? Isn't that the same as what occurs in northern cities?
Absolutely. And what the data, so the people who have done the best job of collecting data on police shootings since about, I think it's like 2015, has been the Washington Post. And what their data show is actually, uh, the shocking thing is that it's how uniform police shootings of unarmed Black people is across the country. It's just that many, if not most, of the highest profile ones, the most outrageous ones, are not in the South. That doesn't mean that none are in the South. It just means that the preponderance are not.
But if you're talking about power and governance, we have a Black mayor, we had a Black DA who initially prosecuted, raised the charges against Garrett Rolfe, who shot Rayshard Brooks. How does that, the figure with your idea that if you have a concentration of power within an administration, things turn out differently, especially in terms of mass incarceration or criminal justice?
Right. And I would argue that things are different in Atlanta than they are in New York. That Black people in Atlanta are not literally stalked, which is what stop and frisk was in New York City. Right. The problem with people who with the question around the plan is the idea that if it does not produce perfection, then it is a failure. That's not the measurement, because then every city in America that was white run up until recently, you didn't get the first Black mayor in a southern city until Atlanta in 1974. He was Maynard Jackson elected in 1973, but he took office in 1974. All of the problems before and that was because Atlanta became a majority Black city in 1970. Every problem that Atlanta experienced before that, or do we ascribe it to the fact that they had a white majority and the white police chief and a white mayor? If you use the argument that Black majority will not produce perfection, that argument is a form of racial oppression. You cannot demand perfection of Black control when you have never used that measurement as a measure of white control.
Well, this is working, Charles, because a lot of people are asking us how this is actually going to happen. Like, what are the strategies? What are the tools? You made the case to Jesse Jackson and Reverend William Barber in your book. Has anyone told you, like, they've moved south because of your book, because of your mentor?
A lot of people, but I published a book in the middle of a pandemic, so you just don't get out. So the book tour has been here with this book. So you don't see as many people, you don't get out as much. So it's very hard to gauge the raw numbers. So you only get it in anecdotes. People who say on Instagram or send you an email that I moved or I'm considering it or I bought property. I just can't measure the scale.
All right, so Lutal, I'm going to try and combine a couple of questions here. I love the book. To your knowledge, are there groups that are in various stages of executing your strategy? Hold on one second, because someone asked a similar question. In your book, you speak of organizations that existed during the Great Migration, not only to encourage but facilitate the movement of Black Americans to the North. No such organizations exist in regards to the reverse migration. As a Black American, man of privilege, and the author of this book, do you plan to use your resources to form such an organization? I guess you're doing it in some ways, right?
Well, I'm not forming an organization. That's not. I'm a journalist.
You're doing the manifesto, right?
Yeah, I will write.
Chicago Defender.
Right. Exactly. So I use the Chicago's Defender as a role model because they were journalists who used their journalism as a way of kind of providing a moral and civic framing for an encouragement for the Great Migration. I position myself in that space. I will remain a journalist. I will not start an organization to do that. But it is true that, groups like the Urban League took on as their mission. It was a very young group at the time, took on as their mission, trying to help people assimilate. And I have openly questioned why there are now 1,200 majority Black cities in America. 90% of them are in the American South. It is hard to find, if I'm going to leave out Florida and Texas. Other than that, it is hard to find a major city in the American South. Not hard to find. The majority of major cities in the American South now have Black mayors. From Shreveport to New Orleans and Jackson and Atlanta, you go all the way up. Wilmington, Delaware has a white mayor, but so I had a call recently with, I think, 13 or 14 of these mayors, just to like a book talk like this, and I just said, "What are you guys doing?" There's no, these kids are moving on their own. In 2016, there was one year that we had data for 82,000 Black millennials alone, no other age group, millennials, left the North and West and moved back to the South. They're moving. Is there no organized campaign, messaging, PR, help on the ground, recruitment? Nothing. So they listened and they gave me their thoughts, but I just, talking like I talk to you, I just any other book talk.
You're not
That's not my
on
job.
bus
I'm
tickets
not. I'm
or
not going to write your policy for you. But I'm going to talk about my book, and I think that this is crazy that you guys are not doing anything.
well, it's funny you talking about millennials because you present this image of two Black Americas, right? Those who stayed behind and those who left. And among the latter, there are generations of people who are leery of the South. I actually had the great fortune of interviewing Wilson Pickett many years ago when he was alive. And he was talking about flying down to Fame Studios. He came from Prattville, Alabama, and he was flying back over to go to Muscle Shoals Studio to do some recording and saw those cotton fields down there, saw the South, and was just completely shook, that he was returning to this place that his family had run away from, essentially.
Yes.
So he's now dead, of course, but representative of this, those who have far less sympathetic vision of the South than you and people who are younger who maybe came down for summers to visit their grandparents or whatever. How do you get beyond that?
Well, I mean, they're just facts. I just present the facts, right? So, number one, the municipal South is Black. So you live where you live, New York. There's 2 million Black people in New York, but you're still only 25% of the population. You haven't had a Black mayor in 30 years since David Dinkins, and that was the only one that you have ever had. And only under that Black mayor did you have your only Black police chief. You haven't had a Black governor of the state of New York since Patterson, and Patterson only got the job because the other governor got caught up in a scandal. And when Patterson tried to run on his own, he was roundly defeated. I think he withdrew before the election even happened. You can stay there, but you are powerless and impotent in New York City. And even if you left, if you are part of thinking about Democrats or Republicans, and that is your motivation, New York State is still going to be blue, even if every one of you left. And this is the same city that the mayor and the white citizens of that city allowed them to stalk you during. And I raised boys in New York City at that time during stop and frisk. And every time that Quinnipiac asked the citizens of New York if they agreed with stop and frisk, even though it was doing this damage to these Black boys and men, a majority of white people in New York City said they were perfectly fine with it. And that is why I say that racial egalitarianism and liberalism are not completely overlapping circles. Also, people think that if you live in the shadow of prosperity, that you are somehow sharing in that prosperity. The Black poverty rate in New York City is higher than the Black poverty rate in Mississippi. Now, maybe you can figure out some way to live as a single person on $17,000 in Mississippi, but there is absolutely no way that you can live on $17,000 as a single person in Manhattan. So you tell me if your life is better. And if you believe that it is, stay put.
Well, there are a number of people. We only have a couple minutes, but they want to know about current events, certainly. Let's see here. Norman says, I'm proud you chose to move to Atlanta. I think we can all agree to that. Your column in today's Times discussed the present and future condition of the Republican Party as it becomes the Trump Party and of the January 6th insurrectionists and even further to the right. Can we bridge the gap in beliefs and avoid an inevitable blow up? What is the actual defense to which you
I don't know the defense. And anybody who is not petrified for the democracy, for our democracy, is not paying attention.
Well, that's what I guess I was getting at when I said your faith in democracy, your faith in the institutions that uphold it.
Listen, it could all blow up. If it doesn't, you're still stuck. So you have to either, if you are completely fatalistic, you just say, throw up your hands and say it's over, no matter where you live. But for us to get up in the morning every day and go to work and come home and feed the kids, we have to have some level of optimism that it's not all over. And if you have some level of optimism that it's not all over and that things will somehow work themselves out and will last, then you have to say, what do I want the future for these children to look like?
Well, this is one of the points in the book you write of this existential divide, this line between those who believed America is in need of redemption, capable of it, like Dr. King. It's just sick, it needs to be healed, or what ails America on the racial question is terminal and hopeless. Where are you, Charles Blow, on that?
As I write in the book, I have a foot in both camps. That I do not believe that anything will completely and permanently solve anti-Black racism in America. Even the browning of America will not solve anti-Black racism in America. Also in that implicit racial bias data, they broke down by racial group their pro-white anti-Black bias. Hispanics had almost as much pro-white anti-Black bias as white people. Southeast Asians had more pro-white anti-white bias than white people. In the 2016 election, a third of all Hispanics and a third of all Asians voted for Donald Trump. That was after all of his racism against Barack Obama. That was after him calling the Mexicans rapists and whatever. It was after him saying that Islam hates us. They still voted for him. In immigrant communities after the 2002 election, according to an analysis by the New York Times, that is where Trump support actually surged. It is not, being against white supremacy is not the same as being against anti-Blackness. Mm-hmm. In many of the societies which our immigrants come from, in fact, it's hard to find a society on the planet where there is a difference in the way people look. There's some who are lighter and some who are darker. And in those societies, the darker people are not assigned the lower caste. That doesn't solve it either. The browning of America does not solve it. And I'm trying to just get Black people to say, there is no, so that is the part of me that's the part of me in the camp that says this is a problem that is going to persist. The other foot, though, is that there are ways to fix things and that this plan is one way to shift power. It is not about how many absolute people you have. People say, well, Black people shouldn't expect that. They're 114% of the population. Doesn't matter. There are 7 states right now where white people are 95+% of the population. Number one, nobody ever says, oh, that's a problem. That's a racial problem. We shouldn't have a state like that. As if there are no other people there because nobody wanted to move there. No, that's not always the case. The Oregon region, which is not just Oregon, but it's several states in the Northeast, had a racial exclusion policy. It was called a lash law. If you lived in the Oregon region, you were forced as a Black person to move out. If you did not, Black men were given 2 years, Black women were given 3 years. If you were still there after that, that's why they called it a lash law. They would drag you out to the middle of the street and whip you, and then tell you to leave, right? So don't pretend that this is just because the only reason the Black people are not there is because, oh, that's just not where they chose to settle. Or that the only reason the Native Americans are not there is that's not where they chose to settle. And as opposed to them a campaign of violence and slaughter against Native Americans. Don't pretend that it just exists that way just because of natural migration patterns. Number one. Number two, those 7 states control, I think 6 states control 1 out of every 6 Senate votes right now, every 6 senators. But the total population of all those states put together is 1/4 of the total population of Black people in this country. The total population of all those states put together is about 3% of the total population of America. And they control 1 out of every 6 Senate seats. It is not about your absolute number in America. It is about where you are geographically in America, according to the Constitution. Half of the power is given based on the population, and that's the compromise with the legislative branch. Half the power is based on population, but the other half is just based on geography. You live in the right city, in the right state, you control it. Even if all six of your states is only 3% of the population of the country.
And there's the manifesto. It's the great kind of spirit we're looking for at the end.
Right.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you speaking with us. And we encourage you to support Acapella Books, your local bookstore, by buying The Devil You Know by Charles Blow there. You can do it on the Acapella book site or at the Atlanta History Center website. And we thank you so much for tuning in to us tonight. So many good questions. I'm sorry I didn't get to all of them. Join us next Wednesday. That's May 19th, when John Furling is going to be in conversation with Jim Sefcik, I hope I'm saying that properly, about his book, Winning Independence, The Decisive Years of the Revolutionary War. That's next Thursday, May 20th. I'm going to be talking with Jennifer Lapidus. She's got a book about Southern Ground, Reclaiming Flavor Through Stone-Milled Flour. For a full schedule and Zoom links and to all of the virtual author events coming up, visit atlantahistorycenter.com. Thank you again, Charles Blow, so much.
Thank you.
And thank you all for being here tonight.
All right, bye.
Good night.